implies an average person or actor, and sports is essentially just an activity involving physical exertion and skill, which an individual or team competes against another. Based on these definitions, we want to clarify that we don't advocate for keeping politics out of the lives of athletes. We're just arguing that politics should not be a part of the actual sports competition. With that, let's move on to our first affirmative argument, which is going to be mental health. Starting with some background, sports exist for two main reasons. From an audience point of view, they bring important entertainment, because according to 69% of Americans, they're watching sports to escape their daily lives or be entertained. But from an athlete's point of view, they bring a career and a passion. So let's start with our first subpoint, the audience. Currently, sports viewership is expected to increase in 2025, driven by growth in digital viewership, competition for media rights, and the increasing popularity of women's sports. Sports fans have, strong, deeply ingrained identities tied to their team. So usually you're not going to see any sports fans like changing which team they support. The links here is that keeping politics out of sports is important because it means that sports can stay a source of entertainment. Currently, people don't watch sports for many other reasons other than the fact that they want to escape their daily lives and watch something that's fun. They want to be entertained. But if sports became politicized, people would start boycotting different sports teams or strategically choosing whom to support. Something that, again, is difficult because sports teams have really deeply ingrained ties to the team that they already support. Audiences would also be scared to talk about sports because now something that they believe or something that they like has become a polarizing issue because, again, sports are involved in or politics are going to be involved in sports. That draws in a lot of unnecessary impacts. For example, during a sport game that got heated over politics, President Trump criticized the protests, and it led to many fans choosing to boycott NFL games instead. That's going to be really bad because now you see that these games have a lot less popularity, have a lot less people watching, and ultimately you see boycotts, which hurts not only the audience, but of course the games and the athletes, organizations that are supporting it. The second impact here is that athletes would also be scared to talk about sports because, or sorry, audiences and athletes would be scared to talk about politics and sports because now the line between the two is very unclear. And the final impact here is that viewership would overall decline because sports would be drawn away from its overall cause of entertainment, which was the reason why it was created, and shift into something that it's not, a political background, which is something that we would argue is really bad because it takes away
POI.
what sports was made for. Yeah.
If you have some athlete that like every time they're not playing football, they're going around being like, I hate Trump and saying all these say very liberal things or something like that. Don't you think that like the fans watching the game and the athlete themselves would still be aware of this as the game would happening? And it's not like everyone would just like forget that this happened as soon as the game started.
Sure, two arguments. First, we would argue that that's never happened. I don't think an athlete has done that. But secondly, we would argue that when it becomes involved in the sport game, that's when it uniquely is bad because now you see sports that are being boycotted. But we would argue that it's a lot better when it's not involved in the actual game. Cool. Subpoint B is going to be athletes. The uniqueness here is that athletes already deal with, immense pressure to perform at really high levels, facing constant scrutiny from media, fans, and sponsors. But when politics enter the equation, it just adds an extra layer of stress, which is a huge mental health burden on these athletes. They're already dealing with a lot of pressure. And the link here is that when you have more politics in sports, it makes the game not only less entertaining because these athletes have more pressure and are playing worse, but also secondly, that these players themselves already have like a huge mental health issue going on because then they're always going to be thinking about politics. The second link here is just that athletes are going to be pressured to speak in certain ways or have certain beliefs about politics, which means now you have these athletes on certain teams who could be divided on political issues, or you have the entire team only supporting one side. Now that hurts the athletes and the people who are watching it. Let's give an example. A tennis star Novak faced multiple controversies because he had outspoken political views, right? His stance led him to be excluded from major tournaments, divided the fan base, and overall hurt his career. You see a lot less people supporting him, and overall you saw him suffer. You saw his career suffer. So for those reasons, we would argue that the audience and athletes would suffer. Moving on to the second affirmative argument, public perception. Currently, the focus of sports is on athletes and their performance, and they're also bound to sports teams by legally binding contracts, which means that athletes can't actually leave the team until the contract expires. But once we allow politics into sports, we would see athletes use their platforms to promote their political views. We would see athletes being more scared to join sports teams and sign contracts because they're afraid of what that would do for the reputation, because again, these contracts are binding. So now you see these athletes who are not sure what sports team to join or being bound to a sports team that they don't necessarily agree with. Again, to give an example, when Houston Rockets started supporting protests in Hong Kong in 2019, it ignited criticism and the focus started shifting from basketball to these geopolitical tensions. We would argue that this does a couple of things. First, takes the fun out of sports for the audience because it's not actually about, the fun. It's about politics. Second, it means that if an athlete disagrees with the political views of their team, there's nothing they can do about it because they're legally stuck there due to that contract. That means that they would have to go against A, their political views, B, their religion, C, their morals. In addition, if athletes were forced to play for teams they don't like, they wouldn't train as hard or try as hard, making overall the game less entertaining. You would see, thirdly, the quality of these athletes decrease. Now you see these athletes who aren't playing well. They either disagree with their team, they don't have good team cohesion, and you could see more athletes either leaving the sport or just playing worse. Couple of impacts here. First, it's just that the quality of sports is going to decrease as a whole. When you see athletes that don't like to play the sport, athletes who aren't training as hard, you're going to see them not play as well, which ultimately means the sports aren't doing great. Second, you're obviously going to see less audience as well, because when the sports isn't doing as great and you don't see the viewership as high, that's not going to be great. Cool. Moving on to subpoint B about sponsorships and team funding. As a uniqueness here, sports teams rely on sponsorships from companies for funding. In 2023, that was over $100 billion. But the link here is that companies would withdraw that from sports teams and entities because they're now political. Companies probably want to look neutral in order to maintain a broad consumer base, or they're going to only support one side, so withdraw from certain sports teams. A couple of examples. Pilsner Urquell withdrew sponsorship from the 2024 Olympic Games after IOC permitted Russian athletes to compete. The second example here is an NBA athlete tweeted about the protests in Hong Kong, which means that several companies that sponsored him pulled out. And ultimately, there's a couple of impacts here. First is that sports teams forced to shut down because they don't have enough money, and B, athlete unemployment. They're going to, stop playing for these teams, and there's ultimately going to be a loss of sport industries. So ultimately, sports are a poor platform for real political change, and that's why we affirm.
Okay, fantastic. If anyone isn't ready, please let me know. If not, I'll start my time on my first word. So just to quickly sort of sketch out how we're going to go about this case here on the opposition. First, a couple things in terms of the characterization of this motion and the definition, and then one sort of just top-level weighing argument about the kinds of impacts you get from side government and why they're ultimately not going to be particularly valuable in this round. And then you're going to get two contentions from side opposition. So let's get started. So first, in terms of the definitions, I'd like to note here that there's like things that could be construed as being technically outside the actual sports game itself that are still very integral to the sports and which can still be like politicized. And we think they should still fall under the government's definition, which is to say that like an interview an athlete conducts immediately after a game, or like what they do when they're getting the, medals or awards right after the game. Like, sure, this could be construed as their personal lives, but we ultimately just don't think like this is a good way to characterize this. We do think this is part of the sport here. Like, we think that if their definition is like, hey, you can't say political stuff while you're like throwing the football itself, like this is obviously a pretty tight and like nonsensical definition. Obviously, we have to consider, the chances that athletes actually get to voice their opinions within the context of the sports game, which is like the post-game interview or like the medal ceremony. You can look to the fact that like most of the times we see politics in sports, this is the context in which we see it. That being said, two general observations. First of all, and this hasn't really become a problem yet, but we can argue that sports should be in that politics should be in sports to some degree without necessarily arguing that all politics currently in sports are good, which is to say we don't have to prove that in every single circumstance there should be politics in sports. We only have to prove that there exists some non-zero number of circumstances in which there could be politics in sports, and that's enough for us to win this round. But second of all, the impact that you get for basically all of their points, and there are a couple of others that I'll get to later, is like the quality of sports, right? Like people aren't going to enjoy it as much, the athletes are going to do worse. And I just like to make a couple top-level framing arguments in terms of this impact. First of all, the quality of sports is relative, which is to say that if every athlete does worse, your experience of the game is actually the same. For instance, 100 years ago, everyone ran slower and couldn't like lift as heavy weights, but we still enjoyed sports to the same amount because it's entirely a relative game, i.e., how well is this team doing relative to the other team? This is why like Little League baseball can still be fun, even though relative to the MLB, they all really suck, right? So like this impact doesn't actually manifest in the experience. Second of all, even if we grant them their best impact here, which is escapism, it's not entirely clear why this is a unique impact. Like if for some reason you lose escapism via sports, you can still like watch a movie, listen to music, hang out with your friends. Like there are other ways you can get this impact. So even if now you can't escape at all through sports, it's unclear why escapism through sports specifically is valuable. And finally, we tell you that all the impacts here are relatively short term, which is that like maybe you perfectly forget politics for like 90 minutes the soccer game is happening, but then like we don't think these impacts actually extend far past the end of this game. So you're always not going to be valuing those impacts highly for those three reasons. But now getting into op case. The first contention here is on free speech. There's a principled claim and a pragmatic claim. The principled claim is pretty simple. Hey, free speech is probably a good thing for people to have. We think that people have inherent dignity and inherent value, and we think that allowing people to say what they believe is a fundamental extension of that dignity and the human right to free expression. To beat this claim, side government has to prove why humans are not, inherently deserving of dignity or expression. They're welcome to try and do that. We also think that if you don't buy this more like deontic right-based claim, there's also probably just a utilitarian claim, which is that like free speech is generally a good thing. But now getting onto the second sub-contention on this free speech argument, which has to do with the pragmatic claim of weaponization. The basic claim here is that it's very hard to draw lines on what exactly is political and what exactly isn't political. And this is bad for a couple of reasons. First of all, we think that bad actors can apply pressure to international organization in terms of what exactly they define as good and bad speech. You can look to the fact that, say, the Russian Federation interfered with what FIFA was doing when FIFA was like testing their athletes for doping. And so it's obviously the case that in other cases too, bad actors can apply undue pressure to political organizations. What that means is that, maybe some organization says that a certain kind of speech that one particular athlete did is bad, where it is bad and actively political, whereas another kind of speech isn't technically political. And we think that this weaponization means that certain kind of speech can be excluded. And we also think that this can happen not only from governments, but within the sport itself, which is to say, maybe one athlete thinks that like there's some inherent structural racism in their sport or something like that. But maybe the like FIFA or whoever it is, or the Olympics, say that this is a political kind of speech and bar the athlete from saying these kinds of things while they have the platform of the event or whatever, right? I think it's pretty clear to see how this can lead to a slippery slope where organizations try and censor criticism of them. Or for instance, like if the Olympics are being hosted in Russia, Russia can apply pressure to the Olympic to try and get them to censor a certain kind of speech. We think this is bad. But now the second contention here is basically just on like battling oppression and other bad actors. The first claim here, the first sub-contention, is that we think that like there is an inherent political context to sports, which is to say that like when we host the World Cup in Qatar, where the stadiums were built using practically slave labor, or when we have the Olympics in Soviet Russia or like Nazi Germany, right, we think that there's inherently a political context to the sporting event itself. And we think that in that case, neutrality has a political subtext which tends to benefit existing power structures, right? Because we think that neutrality within this context is seen as sort of implicitly condoning what's going on. And we think that this means that you're ultimately going to be biased towards existing power structures, which is to say, if we host the Olympics in like North Korea in 2032 and no one can say anything about North Korea, and we just have all the signs and ads saying North Korea like 20 whatever, like this is going to be lots of fun, like sure, even if no one says anything political, there's still a political subtext which still exists to benefit, say, the North Korean regime. The second contention here is we think that athletics is a very powerful platform from which we can bring attention to minority causes, right? We think that it's like relatively harder to exclude minorities from sports because it's like very clearly merit-based, like you can run at a certain speed. And we think that this gives minorities a chance to say, prove certain things to the international community or take certain stances. And this is a platform that's relatively unique and that they otherwise wouldn't have. And we think this is a massive impact that you're completely losing on side government. But we also think that it's important for the international community to be able to take stances on certain categorically bad things using sports. For instance, when like Russia invaded Ukraine and we were like, you can't participate in certain sports, we would say that this is a good thing that the international community is able to do, right? We think that when you, for instance, lock a certain country out of the like cultural sense of sport or whatever, it's more likely that there's both external from the other countries and internal within the country itself pressure on that government to say reform itself so that people can like do sports again or something like that, right? And we also think there's just symbolic value to the international community being able to take a stand on, say, human rights abuses in a certain country through the generally accessible medium of sports, right? We think that is just good. And finally, the last sub-contention here is on the integrity of the event, which is basically that like if the athletes can't say anything about the political subtext of a certain sporting event, the audience is still aware of that subtext. And we think there's a certain cognitive dissonance when you're aware of the subtext, but like the commentators and the athletes can't say anything about it, that actually ruins your enjoyment of the sport. This directly clashes with their impact to the enjoyment of the sport. But now quickly getting on to GovCase. So first of all, in terms of mental health, I've sort of, talked about the impacts here on the audience. In terms of the athletes and why it's like really bad, we do say that like we're not forcing athletes to be political on our side. If a certain athlete thinks it's better for them to not be political, then they cannot be political on our side, right? The fact that there exist athletes who chose to be political means that athlete decided that for them, the best thing to do was to do this. But then in terms of perception, they say that like, oh, what if you disagree with your team's politics? Teams themselves don't take political stances, right? And we think that if you disagree with the politics of someone else on your team, you've probably talked about them, you've probably talked with them about politics either way. So this impact, first of all, doesn't make sense insofar as teams don't have meaningful political stances, but also non-unique insofar as you probably have had political conversations with your teammates either way. For all those reasons and so many more, I really couldn't be prouder to oppose here.
Okay, cool. Okay, so my speech is going to be an 8-minute MG, and the order for this is going to be starting on really quick top of case, and then I'm going to go over the AF sheets in order, and then the neg sheets in order. Is anyone not ready? All right. My time will start now. So first, I want to cover this definition of sports and what constitutes something as being involved in sports, which has been a hot topic in today's debate so far. Our opponent tells you that, for example, a post-game interview or something like a medal ceremony should be included in our definition of sports. And we are going to concede this. If an athlete is making decisions that are connected to their sports team outside of the sports, we believe that that is still in the context of sports. However, when we say that we're not talking about an athlete's personal life, we're not talking about anything that an athlete isn't doing for clout or for fame. So athletes should still be able to have political views in their personal life. They also tell you a couple more things here. First, they tell you that they don't have to prove that in every single case that politics should be involved in sports. They tell you, quote, if we prove one instance, it's okay and we win. Judge, this is simply not true. They agree to our weighing mechanism of net benefits in today's debate, which means that they agree that they have to prove their burden on net, which generally means in more than 50% of cases. So don't let them win today's debate if they're able to prove one case. That's simply unfair. They have to prove this concept on net. Second, they tell you on the top of case that the quality of sports is relative, and that if the quality of sports declines from both teams, that no one will actually care. However, this is not true. We live in a society where we're constantly trying to progress and get better. If we suddenly regress, there will be audience backlash and people simply wouldn't enjoy the sport as much. We can tell you that in older times, did you say POI?
Yes.
Sure.
College football is arguably more popular than the NFL in many cases, despite the fact that it's at the amateur level. Why is it the case if it's like the quality of sports or the skill of the players that always determines fan engagement?
Yeah, we can tell you that there would be several reasons. For example, graduates or alumni might want to stay connected to their colleges. That's a really good reason. And there are several factors other than the quality of the athletes themselves. Moving on to the affirmative contentions, they dropped a couple of things here, but they also made some responses. First, they tell you on our point about audience entertainment that there are other ways to be entertained other than sports. However, Judge, I want to bring up a statistic. 70% of Americans watch live sports and regard it as one of the most crucial ways for them to be entertained. This means that 70% of Americans are going to suffer if we let politics become an entity in sports. They tell you that there are other ways to have fun, such as hanging out with friends or watching a movie. However, Judge, that doesn't mean that we should simply eliminate sports. That's no reason to vote neg on this impact. They also tell you that sports are a short-term impact and that they only solve for a 90-minute game. However, sports are interactive. Being part of a community makes you happy. It's not just watching the game itself. It's the actual experience of being part of a sport. They also tell you something about forcing athletes to be political. I want to reiterate, Judge, that our argument is that athletes don't want to be political, and that if we vote negation, we're giving them a reason that they have to be constrained to being political. Sorry, I'll take it later. Maybe. Sorry, we tell you that if we vote neg, that means that athletes inherently have to be political because they have to be part of an entity that's political, which is their sports team. Now, I want to move on to something very important that they dropped on this contention. We give you the impact that audiences would be afraid to talk about sports. This is because their sports teams would be political entities. And as we know, people are very afraid to talk about politics because it's often something that's very polarizing and can ruin relationships. So we have to flow this through and flow that people are going to stop talking about the things things that they love, which is very important. On our second subpoint about athletes, they completely dropped this entire subpoint. We tell you that athletes are going to deal with extreme pressures to not only do the right thing and play the sport correctly, but also to say the right thing in interviews and say things that would make their sports teams and their fan bases happy. We tell you that the overall mental health of athletes is going to decline, and they completely drop this impact. Moving on to our second affirmative contention. They only make one response here. They say that teams aren't going to take political stances. However, I want to tell you, Judge, that even if teams don't take political stances, the involvement of individual athletes or actions during a game implicitly carries political meaning. So if we allow politics into sports, everything a team does is going to be seen as political, whether they abstain or not. I also want to extend what I told you about athletes being scared to join sports, being scared to sign contracts, being scared to even be on a team that they're on because they're worried about their political image and their public perception, because the team that they would join is going to be political. I also tell you, Judge, that athletes would be trapped into political views that they don't agree with in the negation world. We simply cannot let this happen because this is a violation of the athlete's right to free speech as well, because they don't have the freedom of expression. They're trapped in a political entity that they cannot escape because they are bound by a legally binding contract. Yes.
So is the argument here that like teams are going to be forcing their athletes to like say certain political views? Like when has that ever happened?
Yeah, so the argument here is that athletes are legally bound to their teams. And if their teams say certain things, the athletes by association being part of that team are also seen as part of that viewpoint. Moving on to our subpoint B on the second affirmative contention about sponsorships and team funding. They completely drop this contention, and we have given you several examples of how companies don't want to sponsor teams that are political. So we tell you that the entire sports industry is going to face a loss of revenue because companies simply don't want to support teams that are political at all. So we tell you that ultimately sports are a poor platform to be able to do this activism in. Moving on to the negation sheets. On an overview here, they have to prove that the activism will work if you want to vote negation on their first contention about free speech. Just remember that the activism wouldn't work for two reasons. One, fans would stop watching sports. Remember that audiences literally boycotted the NFL in 2017. The second reason is that no activism would occur in sports because the fan base of sports don't care. Sports isn't the platform for activism. There are more effective ways to spread activism. Sports fans watch for entertainment, as we have proven. They tell you that it would lead to dignity or expression if we allowed politics in sports. Once again, remember that we agree that humans should have the ability to have free speech. However, we tell you that in the context of sports, it does more harm than good. Second, they tell you that there would be like no line between what's political and what's not. On free speech, I tell you that athletes can freely speak out on social media, on their personal life, and anything that's not related to a sport. So a post-game interview, they probably wouldn't be talking about politics, but on their personal social media, that's different. They tell you that certain kinds of free speech can be excluded, and that for example, if we were to fight back against structural racism in sports, that would be okay. However, Judge, they concede our definition of politics, in which we tell you that politics are directly about like political tensions and about geopolitical relationships. So structural racism, being a structure that's social, not political, is not actually a political issue. Protected time, sorry. Moving on to the second negation sheet about battling oppression. They give you this example. If we host something in North Korea, if we host the Olympics there, for example, and no one says anything, there's political subtext. I want to give you two responses here. First, this would not happen. Second, we can fight this outside of the context of sports. Sports isn't the platform to fight against oppression in North Korea. In today's round, we're talking about sports teams and individual sports players. Institutions such as the Olympics are not a part of sports themselves because they're not involved in the actual competition according to our definition of sports, which was conceded. They also tell you on this contention that it gives minorities a chance to prove certain things if they are allowed to talk politically in sports. However, I tell you that there are several other methods that minorities can use to have their freedom of expression, such as social media, nonprofits, fundraising, protests, and donating to research. They can do that without talking about like politics in the context of sports. And we tell you that under this resolution, we have the right to say that. I also want to mention once again that structural racism and structural violence are social structures, not political structures. So speaking out about like racism or sexism or violence like that isn't necessarily speaking out about politics. We tell you, and it goes conceded, that politics is about like political structures. So if athletes talk about politics, they would just get excluded from the sports community. They would continue to be censored, and that's empirically happened, and it went dropped by the negation. Because of the right to free speech, the right to expression, and the audience's mental health, we must affirm. Thank you.
Okay. So if I could just have a few seconds. Are all of the judges and opponents ready? Okay, great. I will start my time on my first word. Okay, so first I'm going to be starting on the gov case, then I'll move on to the op case. First thing I want to discuss is top of case on this idea of a burden. The very first thing that the gov comes here and tells you is that, in fact, all we have to do, all they have to prove is prove that in over 50% of cases, the politicization of sports is bad. We think that this is a very logical burden. Logically looking at the motion, gov has to prove that we should keep politics out of all sports. So if we prove a case where they should be in sports, then we win. But beyond that, their argument is that we should be keeping politics out of sports. We are arguing for giving athletes the agency to be involved in politics in any capacity. As long as 1% of cases involve politics in sports and that being beneficial, ultimately we should be winning this debate. With that out of the way, I don't think it should make a huge difference, because like I said, all we have to prove is that largely politics are beneficial to sports and to the world. But let's get into their case. So on their C1 of mental health, they tell you a few things. First, they speak to the audience and the entertainment they can derive from watching the sport. We have two responses. One is that maximum engagement occurs through acknowledging the true reality of any given event. And I point to like the Miracle on Ice, for example, one of the most viewed sporting events in history. Americans, Russians, everyone got super involved in it. Why? Because they acknowledged the geopolitical circumstances involving that event. It was really important that you recognize that. That makes you get into the event and that makes you root for your team. I have never watched hockey in my life, yet I look back on YouTube to watch the Miracle on Ice game because I care about like the American patriotism that came out of it because of historical context of the event. So if anything, you draw in many viewers, you cause many viewers to become engaged and entertain the event itself. But even if you don't buy that, Judge, our second response is that there's like a very small delta here on whether or not the event is politicized when it comes to like engagement on the negative side, at least. We think that there's many positives to politicization, but I think the negatives are small. For example, we look at like Disney. Disney has not lost like mass viewership just because they've taken certain political stances or their movies involve certain political stances. Why? Because the crux of the movie, just as the crux of sports, is entertainment. Ultimately, all you can do is draw people in by the political circumstances of a given event, make it more entertaining to watch, but people aren't going to be like, oh, this sport has political circumstances behind it, I'm turning it off. That doesn't make any sense because ultimately, if you are going to watch a sport, if you are a sports fan to begin with, you're a fan of the sport for what it is, not for what it isn't. Okay, now onto the second kind of implication of this contention on mental health, which is on the athletes themselves. So ultimately, when it comes to the athletes, there's a really important point to be made here on agency. It is better for the athletes to have the agency to choose their political opinions than be forced into silence. For example, when we look at mental health of like the Iranian Olympians, obviously they're going to be less happy if they're forced to compete in the Olympics without voicing their opinions on the human rights oppression that's occurring in their country. If they had to pretend that nothing was wrong while they had this international stage, their mental health would suffer. Ultimately, we think that this is a turn because when athletes are going to be silenced, when athletes are forced into competing on international stages where they just have to go up there with a smile and pretend that they're not going back to an oppressive regime, they are going to be unhappy. They're going to ultimately perform worse and overall make the quality of the sports worse for the audience and the athletes themselves. Our second response here for athlete mental health is that athletes are like inherently political figures because they are famous people. Regardless of whether or not there's like a political element within the sport itself, they still have to go home and continue to be famous people whose political opinions matter in some capacity. So we think that either way, whether or not they employ their agency, the political stances exist. And if the political stances exist, they should have the right to voice their opinions, and that right makes them happier on net. Onto their third kind of sub-contention here on mental health, they tell you that audiences are going to be afraid to talk about sports. First and foremost, I tell you that you can have sports conversations without politics, as we do in the status quo. For example, like I'm a big fan of the Mavericks. Kyrie Irving is on the Mavericks, and he's made some very loud, political, often offensive stances in the past. I can still tell you Kyrie Irving's an incredible basketball player without having to say like, oh, he's made like anti-Semitic remarks in the past. That doesn't really affect like my conversation of sports regarding him because there's a very big distinction between what he does in the sports world and the discussion that I have regarding his last game as a point guard versus what he went out and said in a post-game interview. But beyond that, we tell you that for people who literally cannot distinguish sports from politics anyway, they probably want to talk about politics because they consider that an engaging conversation. Politics will only be brought into the conversation by people who want to bring it into the conversation in the first place. So if I mentioned Kyrie Irving to say, like, let's talk about Kyrie Irving and let's talk about his political stances, that's probably because I'm more interested in the political stances he's had than what he's done in the game. Okay, now on to the C2 on public perception. So first is on this idea of like athletes being pressured to take a certain stance by the people around them. We tell you this is completely washed out because regardless, there's a comparatively less loss of free speech. It's better to have to be pressured towards a certain stance that you believe in some capacity than not be able to speak at all to begin with. But beyond that, we tell you that it's going to occur in either world. And this is a really, really important flaw in their case, which is that if you are in a team surrounded by people who are clearly against the Iranian regime and you just happen to be pro-Iranian regime, either way, you're going to have to be pressured towards a certain stance when everyone's telling you what the hell is wrong with you. Like, you're going to have to buy in some capacity what the people around you are telling you and what the people want you to take. And this also responds to their point on like athletes are going to be pushed away from a team with a certain stance. They're going to be pushed away in either world if everyone around them holds a divergent political thought. No matter what, there's going to be internal pressure, even if it isn't publicized, even if it isn't on like the whole public stage of sports, to go in a certain direction. And that may sway you against, that is going to sway you away from the team in either world. C is on athletes' performance. First, we tell you sports is relative. I think we've spent a whole lot of time on that, and it's not really so important. But beyond that, it won't really make a difference. If anything, we tell you that someone with a divergent political stance from their team is going to work harder to differentiate themselves from the team. And like, if LeBron James had a different stance from the Lakers, I would argue that LeBron James' stance actually is more important than the Lakers' stance because he is the face of the Lakers. So you'd work hard to become the face of the team such that your divergent political stance has a larger platform than the rest of the team. So we think that that's washed out anyways. Now onto their C3 on sponsorships. First, we tell you that taking political stances has the equal opportunity to actually draw in sponsorships. For example, like if the American hockey team takes a very strong stance against like Russian practices, you may draw in like Ukrainian sponsorships, etc. If there is the capacity for them to take it away in the first place. But beyond that, we also tell you like teams don't lose sponsorships, only players might. So if a player has the agency to choose to make a certain opinion and lose a sponsorship as a result, we think it's better for them to have that agency to make the decision in the first place and knowingly do something which may cause them to lose the sponsorship than not be able to make the decision at all. If you want to be Travis Kelce, the most neutral football player of all time who doesn't take a stance on absolutely anything, sure, you can be Travis Kelce. Or if you want to be Colin Kaepernick and risk absolutely everything and lose all your sponsorships to make a political stand, go ahead and be Colin Kaepernick. But it's always better to have the political agency to make your decision in that scenario. Now on to the op case. First is on free speech. Their main response is like this activism isn't going to work because fans are going to stop watching the sports. We think that this is absolutely not true. I point you again to like increased engagement for the Miracle on Ice or many of like the important geopolitical events that have occurred in the past. Second, I tell you, like, if it may do more harm than good to a given athlete, it's still always better to give them the agency to make that decision, even if it harms them. And our final response here is that, like, if athletes are going to be speaking out on social media, they're using their platform as athletes. You can't make this distinguishment where it's like, oh, an athlete making a post saying, like, I'm this great football player, Colin Kaepernick, and I'm posting Black Lives Matter on social media, but that's not related to me, the football player, Colin Kaepernick. Like, obviously, they derive that social media fame from being a football player, from having that famous stance. So we don't really think you can separate the two. It's very similar to like this like post-game interview type of situation. Now onto battling oppression. The first thing they tell you is like we would not host sports in an authoritarian regime. I think that's a little bit of a ridiculous claim, especially given the fact that we've done it like a million times in the past and we just did it in Qatar like what, 2 years ago. So I think that like sports themselves are inherently political depending on where you are going to host the sports. So when we go to Qatar, are not giving athletes the ability to speak out against human rights abuses in Qatar is in fact inherently political in of itself. We won't even get into that, but I will tell you that it's like if you don't allow sports players to actually take the stances on what they're doing, you completely strip away their agency by forcing them to take a political stance in going there and then not letting them speak on it or how they feel on it. And then onto this idea that like minorities and other groups can like battle structural violence in other formats. We think that sports offer a unique ability to speak out with the intention of the world against issues that are going on. When you represent your country, when you are acting as a representative in this sense, you have the world watching you, you have your nation watching you, you are a true representative. It's like the president saying something. And with that, I urge an opposition ballot. Thank you.
Wait, don't mute it. Okay. If anyone needs a couple seconds before I get started, that's totally fine. Just let me know. But
I think we're good.
fantastic. Can you stop your time, Josh? Okay. If not, I will start my time of 4 minutes with 30 seconds grace on my first word. So this speech is going to be relatively straightforward. I'm going to tell you a couple of things that side government is probably going to get up and say in the next speech and why you're not voting for them on any of those things, and then point you to 3 specific places you can confidently cast your opt ballot. So what might side government come up and tell you in the next speech? So first of all, they might tell you that, hey, look, like the audience just won't enjoy watching the sport because they're gonna be like, this is political, this is awful, it hurts my head, I just want to see them kick the ball. So Josh gives you 3 fantastic responses to this claim in his last speech that I think are going to make it much less compelling. First of all, they completely drop our claim on cognitive dissonance. This is the last sub-contention of our second contention, where we say that, like, hey, if every single sports fan knows the political implications of, say, the game between the US and Russia, but none of the players and none of the commentators and no one else is actually acknowledging this, there's a level of cognitive dissonance that makes people uncomfortable and that makes people not enjoy and that makes people not enjoy the game itself, right? This was dropped where you see no responses, so I think this is a pretty, good point for you to buy. But then Josh also tells you that this probably draws in viewers who are, say, politically supporting their country, which means that even if you buy that there's some bad impact on their side, i.e. you losing some amount of fans, we probably make that up in the fans that we actually gain, which means that the ultimate impact of this claim is very small. But finally, he gives you the weighing here, which is that, like, even if some people, stop watching sports, it's not like everyone's going to stop watching sports. See the fact that, like, for every example they give you of political activism, people still watch the NFL, like, even if they boycott it at some point, which means that, like, they don't get impacted this claim of, like, no one's going to watch football anymore, which means that you shouldn't buy this impact, even if you buy it because it affects a relatively small amount of people. But then they might come up and tell you that, hey, athletes are going to be forced into certain stances. Why are you not voting on this? Their mechanism is essentially internal pressure. They say, hey, look, if everyone around you is political and, has certain opinions, then you're going to be pressured into also taking up those opinions. But as Josh tells you, your teammates are going to have political opinions either way, which means that the impact here of, like, being pressured by your teammates is non-unique. It happens in either world, so you shouldn't vote on it. But then even if you buy that it's unique to their side, how many pro athletes are there in the world who find themselves in this particular situation of, like, being pressured by LeBron James to, like, support the Democrats? Like, even if you buy this impact, it's a really small number of people that are ultimately being affected. Like, maybe it's a couple thousand athletes in a world with literally billions of people. Don't prioritize this to a very large extent. But then they might say, oh, sports sponsorship is going to go down, right? First of all, Josh tells you that, hey, we might actually draw in more sponsors, which will cancel out any negative effects they give you. But then we also tell you that, like, hey, if everyone in the sport has less money, you can look back to a relativity claim, right? As Josh tells you, hey, some people enjoy watching college football, even though it's worse, because, as they themselves tell you, people care about things other than the quality of the sports themselves, right? They like their team, they like something else, which means that if the quality goes down overall, we have no reason to believe that this is going to hurt their ability. And finally, if they tell you that you can use social media instead, we tell you that your social media presence is an extension of your, sports existence, and that the fans, will still get your perspective. But where can you cast your ballot on the opposition? First of all, on the ability of the international community to take stances and pressure on other governments. This is the 4th sub-contention of our second point, and it's clean drops. There are no responses here. The impact here is potentially shifting or decreasing abuses within another country. If you buy that there's any minute possibility of us being able to actually end human rights abuses in other countries, you're always going to value this claim over any other claim in this round, because the impact of, like, not being abused, not being enslaved to build a soccer stadium in Qatar is bigger than, like, how much you enjoy watching Travis Kelce or something like this. Like, this is clearly just the biggest impact. But then on calling out structural violence, the only things they say are there are other ways to do it, but that doesn't mean that we're not giving you a good way to do it. Once again, the impact of potentially limiting structural violence is something that not only has huge pragmatic implications, but is also just like something that's like a principled necessity. Like, we ought preserve the ability of people to call out structural violence. But then finally, we tell you that who hosts the tournament has inherently political subtones, right? Like, sure, maybe North Korea isn't hosting, but the USSR, Nazi Germany, and Qatar sure are. And we tell you that when you curtail the ability of athletes to say something, you implicitly end up supporting those regimes, which strengthens their ability to abuse people within their state. These impacts are ultimately far outweigh anything you get from side government. And for all these reasons, I really couldn't be prouder to urge you to cast an opposition ballot.
Okay, awesome. This is going to be the last speech of the debate. It's going to be 5 minutes. I'll just use, again, Grace time like they did. So the order is just going to be going over, like, a quick overview as to why you're voting affirmative, going to framework, and then giving you 2 main voter issues. Cool. Is everyone ready? Awesome. Our opponents assert that we don't care about free speech, freedom, activism, any of that in their last two speeches. But that's just not true. The reason why you're voting affirmative is because of our arguments about why activism happens in both worlds, but the affirmative world doesn't involve it in the game, which means that sports can continue. They completely mischaracterize this round and keep telling you that athletes lose all these rights and, free speech and human rights. But remember that athletes wouldn't be able to talk about politics in our world, athletes would be able to talk about politics in our world, just not in the direct competitive context. Let's start on framework and then I'll get to the main points. They want to tell you that politics can be allowed in 1%, which is why they should win. But remember the observation my partner gives you, the under framework of net benefits is the most fair because you have to prove on net if there's more harms than benefits. But again, that's more of a wash. So let's move on to the main arguments. Let's start on our first contention, which is that of exclusion and censorship. That's going to be the first main voter issue for you. This argument is about why that speech occurs, where and when it occurs is really important. Neha gives you two excellent overviews. The prerequisite, every single argument they make in Ghost conceded. A, that people boycotted the NFL in 2017 and fans just stopped watching, which turns the activism they talk about. That's exactly why we argue that activism should be outside sports, not that it should cease to exist. It's that when you involve it in sports, that leads to the opposite that they talk about, more backlash, and literally nobody has benefits from this. But the B response was that they countered this with like Miracle on Ice. This side's AF. Players weren't actively using the event to promote political views. Media and the public attached the meaning to it afterwards, which is exactly why it's side's AF. That activism happened afterwards, not during the sports games. These two overviews go conceded. When it happened in the sports game, fans left and stopped watching, turns all the activism they talked about. That's going to be really important. Cool. Let's summarize what this argument is really talking about, right? They say that by being political, teams gain new sponsorships. Yeah, sorry, what?
Sorry.
Yeah,
I'm not sure if I'm entirely correctly understanding the claim, but if the claim is that like for some reason the audience's backlash is going to like actively hurt the activism and make it worse, this feels like a new claim that's sort of responsive to our general like activism is good claim that we've been giving since really the beginning of our first speech. So this feels new. But
I'll just respond and then, but judge's discretion. So I'm just countering like the Miracle on Ice example with the golden turns, and then the stuff about how activism gets worse. This is just extending like our first contention about why, when it's like involved in sports, they like boycott the sport. But judge's discretion. I'll just move on from the points, continuing on the sponsorships. Cool. Cool. They say that teams are going to gain new sponsorships. This is the like that was a new response in the block, so I'll respond to it here. But organizations literally ban political sponsorships. We give you examples of organizations that literally banned political ones because they seek to avoid controversies. They dropped this because it prereqs. There's a couple of reasons why that's really important. First is that they have to prove that their impacts come first, but we prereq because a sports team having money is a prerequisite to the sports team existing at all. But B is that when people boycott, then again the sports team doesn't exist. These two things prereq their argument. And those were the observations that my partner gives you. That's really important because it comes before any of their impacts. Organizations banned the political sponsorships, stopped giving teams money, teams or audience stopped watching and literally boycotted the NFL, which means in order for any of their impacts to happen, you have to look to our side first. But let's weigh and just kind of compare impacts. First, they have to prove the activism will work. Remember that it wouldn't because fans will stop watching and no activism occurs because the fan base just doesn't care. They're watching for entertainment. But B, even if you don't buy that, on prerequisite, a sports team having any of the money is like really important because the sports team has to exist. What this means really simply is in order to believe any of their impacts about minorities' rights, human rights, or freedom, judge, you need to have a sports team existing before that. That's essentially what a prerequisite means. And our impacts come before their impacts because a sports team existing comes before any of that. They concede that sponsorships are necessary for a sports team to survive. We prove that teams A, lose sponsorships in the net world, and B, the audience boycotts the entire NFL and stops watching it, which means you have to vote at first because sequentially our impacts come first. You can't talk about the free speech or cognitive disassociates in sports if the sports don't exist in the first place. That's really important because even under their framework, the 1% thing, if you don't have a sports team, you don't allow for even that 1% of human rights to exist. Sports teams don't exist in the net world because of sponsorships. That's going to be really, really important. Cool. Let's just kind of summarize what this entire voter issue is about. It's about exclusion and censorship. The two main arguments here is that A, people stop watching, and B, they stop getting sponsorship, which essentially means that these organizations are going to stop, supporting them. The reason for this is very simple. They start to avoid controversies. They're going to try to be more neutral. We give you an example, right? Xfinity Series driver, they signed a deal NASCAR and other organizations ban political funds for these sports. And we also saw third, that's when Trump, talked about when Trump pointed out the political activism, we saw that audiences boycotted the NFL in 2017. These the examples should be sufficient to affirm. It shows you that in order to believe any of their impacts, Judge, you have to first look to ours because sports teams don't exist in their world. Cool. So let's kind of summarize this debate about this whole issue of free speech and freedom. We're going to outweigh on free speech, right? They're going to tell you that it's better for people to have free speech than be pressured to talk about anything. Well, we would argue that free speech is not unique in their world. Athletes have free speech in our world. It's just limited in the context of sports. They still have free speech. They also can see, remember, it can happen in social media. It can happen in forum protest, nonprofits. All of these things come sequentially after the sports team. We would argue that the sports team has to exist. Then you can have the activism. The activism we argue in our world is in social media, nonprofits, or protests. All of that can happen separate of sports. Athletes still have free speech. We tell you it's just worse for people to be legally bound to that. And we would argue that athletes have better free speech on our side. Athletes aren't legally bound to opinions that aren't literally theirs. Cool. So let's summarize it. 2 main reasons why you're voting affirmative. First, because we prereq. Because remember the 2 examples we give you, that means in order to have a sports team, you have to vote affirmative. And secondly, because it's better for people to have free speech in other areas. Remember that they're not bound in their worlds. But in our worlds, you have like social media, you have protests, you have nonprofits. Those are the 2 reasons why you're voting affirmative. They come before any of their impacts. Good round.
Good round.
Great round.